Okay, so that's Lightning Data Service, but how do I do it myself? Well, there are a couple components that are using Apex. Let's go look at those.
So you also use the wire service with Apex?
You do. Wire does some pretty clever things. Let's go take a look. There's an Apex wire to property and to function and imperative. We're going to look at those three. So let's start with the one that goes to a property. Here's the markup. I see a template tag with if true. I see a template tag with if true, there are errors. This is a pretty common convention, so wire by default is going to give you a JSON object with two properties, data and error. And so when you're using wire kind of in its native form, you always want to expect that data structure. So you'll see a lot of patterns like this where you're checking if true is there data and if true is there an error. And this is sort of the JavaScript truthy.
Yeah.
Like if it's not null or undefined, it's going to...
It's also sort of like the way REST calls return their response. When they send back something, they don't give you the data, but they give you an error and they give you the error information.
Yeah, and if you remember in Aura, when we used the force record data tag, we would actually, there's an attribute you could bind to target error. Mm-hmm. So we actually would bind the error explicitly to an attribute, and then we'd bind the data to an attribute, and then we'd check which one got populated by data service. Mm-hmm. There's actually the same data service under the hood. We're just using different syntax here. So I expect to find some contacts in that data property, and you can see here I have a for each, and I just go through them and dump out a bunch of contacts. Mm-hmm. But what's special is what's under the hood.
Very little.
How simple is that?
I like that.
So let's break it down. I'm importing the wire decorator. Mm-hmm. Got it. Now I'm importing an Apex method explicitly. So I'm saying this Apex controller, this method, I want to call it. So I can have multiple Apex controllers that I call.
Unlike in Aura, where the entire component could only be bound to one controller, and then you could call multiple methods.
You could delegate out.
You could delegate out, but here you're defining both the controller class and the method.
So you can pick and choose what you intend to use as imports and their hard references. So again,
Once again, metadata aware.
Yeah. So I'm saying, okay, there's an Apex method called getContactList that I want access to. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to wire this property called contacts to that method. And the method is because I named it here in the import. I actually name it differently if I wanted to as well. So I'm saying, okay, I'm going to wire that Apex method to this property, and that's all I do.
You could have multiple properties, different names, wired to the same method.
Sure, if you wanted to. So what's going to happen is when my component runs, it's going to see that wire, the engine, the LWC engine, is going to see that wire. It's going to go to that Apex method and invoke it and pull the data back and put it into my contacts array. Now in this case, I'm not passing any properties, so it's kind of any parameters. So it's kind of a one-off, right? I'm going to get all the contacts, then I'm done. And I populate this contacts property. But that's invoking Apex in one line of JavaScript. And then again, in our property for it, we're simply doing a template for each over the context.data, which is sort of our known ahead of time, that two-part JSON object. Okay, so let's look at the other one. We have Apex method to function. The markup's going to look very, very similar, but you'll see that contacts is now a standalone property and error is a standalone property. So we sort of split out those two. Mm-hmm. And the JavaScript's going to look quite a bit different. So what we've done here is rather than wire, it's the same Apex method, but rather than wire it to a property, we're wiring it to a function because we want to run code. This is our opportunity to say, hey, I'm going to get some data from the database, but I might need to massage it a little bit, or I might need to adjust it. So I'm wiring it just like I did before, but now I'm wiring it to a function, and the error and the data are passed as parameters to my function. So I can use this sort of special syntax to sort of expand it out into two different variable names, and then I'm checking to see if I have data. If I do, I'm populating my contacts property, and if I don't, I populate error. And by populating contacts or error, there's a track decorator. So when I modify that property, I'm going to update my UI. I'm going to cause a re-render to happen because I'm monitoring those values.
Very clean, very clean, and really definitely magic.
All right, so I'll show one more.
Okay.
One more Apex component here. What if I want to just invoke Apex myself, like straight up from JavaScript, call this method? Well, we call that calling Apex imperatively. So in this case, my template's the same. I've got an if true contacts. I'm going to loop over it and dump out all the contacts. And the way I fetch that is this. So I still import getContactList, but instead of using it as a wire, I'm just going to invoke it because it's JavaScript. I'm essentially importing a wrapper that knows how to converse with the Apex method. And so that wrapper is a JavaScript function that I can invoke. I invoke it, and in this case I have no parameters, and it's going to return a promise, and I can do a .then and a .catch like I would normally do as a modern JavaScript developer. So I get a promise back, and I can monitor the state of that asynchronous behavior, and then in the then here, I'm receiving the result, and I put it in my context property. Because I have that track, my decorator on it, it's going to update and re-render my UI.
Got it. So lots of flexibility and slightly different patterns in the JavaScript.
There's a lot of syntactical sugar that's been added in here with this wire behavior. That's really nice. So it becomes trivially simple to get Apex interaction with your components and Lightning Web Components.